Sometimes the people around you foster this sense of hope and tell you that they have seen this one or this difficult person change, and that to give up hope of change, well, that's just defeatist or negative. You end up getting sort of painted as a sort of negative Nelly. Today we're going to talk about a very interesting issue that comes up in a lot of people experiencing or who have experienced narcissistic abuse, and that's the fear of being alone. You'd think you'd want to be alone after being with a narcissist, but let's break that one down. And before we go further, please join this channel, subscribe. We'd love for you to be a part of this community. And any of you have a thought about this, drop it in the comments. Despite having been through a narcissistic relationship, do any of you harbor that fear of being alone, and did that keep you stuck in your narcissistic relationship? So let's talk about the fear of being alone. Fear is one of those things that explains a lot about narcissistic relationships. The fear of being alone, interestingly, is a key part of what a survivor of narcissistic abuse goes through. Being in a relationship with a narcissist is such a mind-twisting experience that you stop trusting yourself. In addition, relationships with narcissists can be so controlling that you can slowly lose confidence in your own abilities. Control in relationships with narcissists is something that is an often observed theme. The narcissists themselves are sort of obsessed with control. And their control means that over time, obviously, they have to run the show, and you may get robbed of the opportunity to make decisions in your own life. And there's a whole video in this series on indecision. So at one level, the fear of being alone may reflect some of the sort of dependency that the narcissistic relationship can bring up, and a false sense of inadequacy that without this relationship, you wouldn't be able to take care of yourself. So despite knowing that you are being treated horribly and recognizing the need for a change and wishing that all of this was different, the fear created by years of invalidation, gaslighting, dismissiveness, and just generally being diminished can leave you believing that you cannot function without the narcissist. And that's a rhetoric that the narcissist often shares, that you wouldn't be able to make it without them, and they'll push that in your face. People experiencing narcissistic abuse, although there may be a sense of relief when it's done, of not having to endure their narcissistic abuse anymore, there's also often the fear that after the relationship, you will be alone forever, that you will not be able to find another partner or another companion. And this fear can get magnified in people who believe that as they get older, that they will be less attractive as a partner, less desirable, etc. And that fear can leave some people just staying in their narcissistic relationship, or if they end up leaving, or their narcissistic partner should leave them, they may feel a sense of panic, anxiety, and euphoric recall. I should have never left that relationship. It really wasn't that bad. That kind of thing. If you are from a narcissistic family, the fear of being alone may be pronounced in scapegoats who always felt they were teetering on the edge of being cast out, but also a byproduct of the conditional love that is the narcissistic family. When it is conditional, it stands to reason that if you don't play by the narcissistic family rule book or playbook, they might let you go. They may not literally put you out on the street, but they may withdraw, withhold, and definitely psychologically abandon you. There can be a precarious sense that always floats around when you are in a narcissistic family system. A sense that your narcissistic parents could cast you out at any time. And because you never know exactly what they want or how to be enough, it can be a pattern of narcissistic abuse that trails you into adulthood. This fear of being alone can be something that predates the narcissistic relationship. But in most cases, this fear is exacerbated by the narcissistic relationship, or this fear comes up through you being in a narcissistic relationship. Many people have said to me that they were independent and strong, happy people, and then they got into this relationship, and years of manipulation, control, gaslighting, all of it turned them from a cheerful, self-reliant, independent person into a person who slowly felt more and more dependent on a partner who was unempathic and dismissive. The toxic combination of control, gaslighting, and devaluation can take you into a space in which you start to wonder if you can actually take care of yourself. Because in a narcissistic relationship, they are so good at fooling your friends and families. Not in all cases, but in not a small majority. The idea of leaving a relationship from a narcissist and striking out on your own can also feel potentially isolating and ramp up that fear of being alone, because everyone wonders why you are leaving and don't quite understand it when you tell them it's because of narcissistic abuse or gaslighting. So what do you do if you have this fear of being alone, secondary to narcissistic abuse? First, practice being alone. And that may be difficult because of your living arrangement or your partner's sense of control, and obviously because of the nature of the world these days. But if there's any chance for you to just be alone and see how it feels, then give it a try. But some of this can also sort of be done inside your head. Play it out in your head. What would it be like to come home to an empty house? To eat dinner alone? To watch TV alone? Imagine someday in the future having to go to events alone, sit at a friend's wedding alone, go to a party alone. There may be some feelings of anxiety, but go deeper now. Think about what it would feel like to not be criticized during dinner, or not be invalidated while you watch TV, or having to watch your partner either showing off at the party while they continue to invalidate you, or complaining about the party. Think that part through too. If you can envision that life of some sense of serenity and peace being alone, then you may be able to push back on that fear. And remember, you may not be alone forever. Number 2 is my tried and true favorite. I'm going to suggest therapy. Chip away at the core in therapy of what is fueling your fear of being alone. Years of being in a relationship in which someone is telling you that you are incompetent and who has invalidated and gaslighted you have left you so confused that you start to believe they're true. They're not, but you start to believe what they're doing and saying is true. If your choice is a manipulative relationship or being alone, I'm going to tell you right now, that's a no-brainer. From a mental health perspective, alone is always going to win. Number 3, I want you to consider support groups, online or otherwise, and someday maybe in person, but to bolster support and spend time with other like-minded people. Number 4, I want you to start doing something you enjoy, and ideally it's something that gives you and fills you with meaning and purpose. And this can include hobbies, volunteering, maybe trying to take on some new, maybe even more advanced responsibilities at a job, going to school or going back to school. The greater the sense of efficacy, which is a word, this feeling of, I feel like I can do this, I can accomplish this, that gives you a little more strength to push back on this fear of being alone. In essence, it gives you a resilience. Fear of being alone is something that may have plagued you before, long before this narcissistic relationship. In fact, your fear of being alone may be why you got into the relationship despite all the red flags, and why you stayed in it despite all of the red flags. But it may also be a byproduct of the narcissistic abuse in the relationship. You may have gone from independent to reliant and dependent, simply within the context of this narcissistic relationship. And don't view the end of your narcissistic relationship, or maybe even distancing yourself from your family, as a sentence to always being alone. There's many people out there who believe my friends are more family to me than my family is. There are people out there who say, oh my goodness, I don't think I'm ever going to meet anyone again. I'll never be able to trust again. And lo and behold, they meet that person who compliments them. And they recognize that there's a huge difference between being in a narcissistic relationship and in a loving relationship. But as I said, there's almost a lot of single shaming in our culture. Oh, you're alone. What's wrong with you? There ain't nothing wrong with you. You're good. You are not withering in a narcissistic relationship. That already puts you ahead of the curve for overall. But the fact is that for a lot of people, being alone feels like a failure. It feels like an abandonment. It triggers a lot of old fears. And all of this fear of being alone, very, very much gets magnified within the context of narcissistic abuse. So let's think about the person who sits there and says, I feel so guilty about the terrible things that I think about the difficult or narcissistic person in my life. It's not easy when you start censoring your own thoughts. A major issue that impedes survivorship from narcissistic abuse is self-blame. The person who is in the narcissistic relationship asking themselves over and over again, maybe I'm the problem, maybe I'm the one to blame. They will internalize the gaslighting and ask themselves, maybe they're right. Maybe I am too anxious. Maybe I am the one who demands too much. Maybe I ask too many questions. Maybe I shouldn't be asking them to do so many things when they're so busy. And maybe I'm just not aware of what's going around me. And maybe I just don't show enough gratitude. That's sort of the endless loop that plays in the mind of somebody who's in one of these relationships. Then the person who believes all these things, I'm to blame, this is all my fault, I'm the one to blame for the mess this relationship is, they believe these things and they'll go into therapy themselves, right? The survivor of narcissistic abuse will go into therapy and they'll say, I need to address my anxiety. And then they'll say, I'm going to stop asking for anything in this relationship. And I'm going to keep trying to express gratitude, because that's what people are often told, right? In order for your relationship to work, you have to express gratitude. So you do all of that. And guess what? Nothing changes. Now, there is a point in any narcissistic relationship where you literally kind of get worn down to a little nub, where you find yourself no longer doing or saying anything because you don't want to be the one who is to blame for the things that are going wrong in the relationship. So if you don't do anything, then maybe you'll sort of be off the hook. But then, can't win in this game, can you? Then they may call you out for not talking enough, for being too quiet, for being boring, for not interacting enough. Ultimately, you can never win. However, for most people who go through these relationships, there's a point, it might happen early, it might happen sometime into the relationship, that starts going into a more bleak territory. And a survivor in one of these relationships starts judging their own thoughts. It's not unusual for survivors to be blaming themselves for thinking to them, they'll start blaming themselves for thinking to themselves things like things people think. Ugh, I can't stand my own father. I can't stand my own mother. I hate my partner. I actually really don't enjoy spending time with my adult child. I think my sister is a self-absorbed idiot. You think those things and then it hits you like, I'm a horrible human being. The closer into these relationships you are, the heavier the trauma bonding and the cognitive dissonance. This can result in survivors judging themselves for having such awful thoughts. So a person will literally think, I can't believe I thought such a terrible thought. Yikes, maybe I'm the monster. Maybe all these problems are my problem. Maybe I'm the awful person, and because I have these awful negative thoughts, I'm the reason this relationship is terrible. Or People just feel guilty. Maybe they don't connect the thought to the relationship having problems, but they just feel guilty for thinking bad things. It's a thought. And the beauty of thoughts is that they should be our uncensored space. They're supposed to be places to explore, our sort of own personal spaceships that allow us to explore an inner universe, go anywhere we want, see how it feels. But there's no need to enact any of it. Just because you're thinking a terrible thing doesn't mean you're going to do it. For example, you may think about getting a divorce, which isn't even necessarily a terrible thing, but you may think about getting a divorce, but you don't have to say anything. You can think about quitting a job with a tyrannical boss, but not actually quit the job. You can think about not showing up to your self-centered cousin's wedding, but you end up going because you actually care about the cousin's parents. So you may think these things. It doesn't mean that they're going to translate into behavior. It doesn't mean I want to slap my sister. It doesn't mean you actually slap her. This self-judgment, self-castigation, self-criticism about your own thoughts about a narcissistic relationship is one more way that these relationships do harm. You judge yourself for having these thoughts instead of recognizing that not only is it okay to have a thought, it's not surprising given how toxic the relationship has become. But the self-blame, self-anger, and at times the self-disgust for having had such negative thoughts can keep people stuck in these toxic relationship cycles. There is so much guilt about having these thoughts that you just punish yourself for having these terrible thoughts by saying, I'm going to work harder. I'm going to be better. I'm going to do better in this relationship. But since it's a narcissistic relationship, it's not likely to change no matter how hard you try. There are some interesting cultural issues here that might that arise as well. I talked to a close female relative once, and I'm South Asian. I'm actually South Indian, and the person's in a pretty narcissistic marriage, and she had told me that the guilt that she had maintained her whole time she was married, about the negative thoughts that she had about her husband, and in fact her guilt about it was paralyzing because she was taught through both religious and cultural teachings and generational teachings that she should have almost pious or reverential thoughts about her husband. And talk about a great example of culturally enabling a toxic relationship, that you're supposed to view this person, your husband, as someone almost holy. And that without maintaining that belief of this pious belief of her husband, that she would actually mess up her karma and other critical religious benchmarks that would not only hurt her, but her other family members. The husband in this case was atrocious, and so she put up, she shut up, and she endured it. But as any normal human being would, she hated the guy. And those hateful thoughts were actually destroying her. Not because they weren't valid, they're her thoughts. By being her thoughts, they're valid. But because she thought she was actually doing something bad by having a thought. The poor woman ended up having many, many health problems for most of her adult life. And I often did wonder if her self-punishment about having these thoughts about this awful husband and the cultural reasons that she wasn't supposed to have these thoughts. Cultural issues also meant she could not easily extricate herself from this narcissistic relationship either. And the cultural sort of criticism she'd faced for leaving it would have been too overwhelming. I was able to see really firsthand how narcissistic relationships not only strip people of their identities and even their potential, but even their inner thoughts. In my conversations with her, I told her that whatever higher power she believed in, if her higher power was benevolent, no benevolent higher power would ever judge a thought, and that radical acceptance basically that her husband was a world-class ass, and and that idea of feeling stuck, secondary to her culture, it's all okay. She wasn't bad for having these thoughts. She was in many ways trapped. That she could actually push through the cognitive dissonance, internally acknowledge his awfulness, and work on the workarounds since she couldn't leave. But it's okay. It's okay to have the thoughts. And in some ways, the thoughts were sort of an off-gassing that helped her feel a little bit more sane. I have talked with many, many people who stayed in narcissistic marriages or stayed in parental relationships for decades, enduring manipulation, passive-aggressive nonsense, gaslighting, and interpersonal poison for lifetimes. And the survivor in these relationships would often get caught up. They would ruminate over one nasty word they may have said during the course of a relationship against the thousands of nasty words they heard from the narcissistic person. And they would hold on to that one terrible thing that they had said. And they'll say, maybe I was the bad one. I said that, so I was at their level. One time, 10,000 times, like the math is off. Many people cannot or will not leave these toxic and difficult relationships. And I get that. Your thoughts, you may not even express, but your thoughts become a sort of a steam vent, a place where it's okay to think, oh my gosh, this is such a horrible person. There is no karmic abacus up in the sky where all of the records on this is kept, and no high and mighty figure saying, well, you are the one to blame for thinking these things, and so you're being punished. Honestly, by not censoring your thoughts, by letting yourself have those thoughts, you may then be able to see the relationship more clearly. And that may more quickly propel you to radical acceptance and less confusion in the face of the cognitive dissonance. Judging our thoughts is a problem, not just in narcissistic relationships, but all around. In fact, mindfulness meditation is about letting your thoughts flow and not judging them. Giving ourselves permission to let our thoughts flow is crucial. It allows us to work the problem. Blocking our thoughts can result in these relationships in denial or rationalization or justification, but also block us from ourselves, block our creativity, and block our ability to solve the stuff in our life. You may be wondering, is the narcissistic person thinking these thoughts about me? Some people are helped by that. They're like, if I know they're thinking this about me, maybe I'll feel a little bit better about it. In most cases, when they don't need you to do something or you aren't inconveniencing, basically the narcissist doesn't think about you at all. It's interesting in that way. You're likely spending more time ruminating and thinking about them than they are thinking about you. And when they are, it's really entirely in the sort of self-serving kind of, are they going to leave me? What are they going to do to me? They're out to get me, or they gave me what I needed and I deserve that anyhow. Another thing that many of you might be thinking about is the kinds of negative thoughts that people ruminate about in obsessive compulsive disorder. People who have OCD will have intrusive, unwanted thoughts, the obsessions, and they will often feel that those unwanted thoughts, those negative thoughts, are actually a real problem. And so they have to offset those thoughts. And those are often the compulsions. So a person will feel that they thought a dirty thought, and then they'll feel compelled to do something like wash their hands 100 times, or organize a bookcase a certain number of times, or go through some sort of ritual that in no meaningful way would connect to those obsessive thoughts. So for some people, these intrusive, unwanted thoughts, especially when they're thinking these negative thoughts, are really problematic. And for some people going through narcissistic abuse, it may be their experience that it feels like the thoughts are coming at them rather than that these are their own thoughts. What I'm breaking down in this video is not so much of what we see in OCD, but sort of the thoughts when a person's just had one more argument or one more problem or just sort of facing one more unempathic moment with a narcissist. In their head, they're thinking, oh my goodness, this is really a terrible person. And just that thought leads them on a cascade of thinking, maybe this is my fault. Maybe I'm to blame. The self-blame is a critical piece of what makes narcissistic abuse so harmful, and that judging of one's thoughts is something that often leaves people feeling incredibly distressed. Think away. This is a private space. Hope dies last. Now, this proverb was actually sent in as an email by somebody who reported it was a German proverb or idiom. And they pointed out that this, hope dies last, is different than the more common English version that we use, and those of us who speak English as a primary language, of hope springs eternal. And they are right. That proverb of hope springs eternal actually has its origins in the writing of Alexander Pope. But I like this saying a little bit better, that hope dies last, because I think it cuts to the chase in a more useful way for understanding narcissism. So what does this saying, what does this proverb, hope dies last, mean for narcissism and narcissistic abuse? Like I said, it cuts to the chase of why people get stuck. I have often spoken about the key factors that keep people stuck in narcissistic relationships: fear, guilt, pity, lack of information, still loving the person, money, children, and hope. It is probably better to call it misplaced hope or unrealistic hope or misguided hope, but at the end of the day, it is hope. And what is the hope for? Hope for change. Hope that the promises will be kept. Hope that things could get better. Hope that the future fakes finally come true. In a narcissistic relationship, this saying could not have more truth. The fact is, a lot of people get stuck because hope indeed does die last. There are lots of reasons for this. Trauma bonding means a complex life comprised of justifications and rationalizations and creating reasons to stay in the relationship. This is a pattern that often got set in childhood and can extend to adult relationships. Sometimes the people around you foster this sense of hope and tell you that they have seen this one or this difficult person change, and that to give up hope of change, well, that's just defeatist or negative. You end up getting sort of painted as a sort of negative Nelly if you suggest that things in a given situation just can't change. And if you spent an entire childhood hoping a parent would change, hoping that things would get better, then you know what it feels like to live in long-term hope, especially when it comes to toxic situations. There is a very human piece to this. To give up on hope can really feel like falling into the abyss, a bit like losing faith. It doesn't feel good. Hope keeps us going, and with the hope gone, then what? Because so many people in narcissistic relationships have completely lost faith in themselves, view themselves as being not enough, have lost their self-esteem. To lose hope in the relationship can, and having little faith in themselves, means that to lose hope really feels like falling into the abyss. It flies in the face of almost all world religious beliefs and traditions, and of every feel-good motivational message you've ever seen. You're not supposed to give up on hope, right? So while hope does spring eternal and does die last in narcissistic relationships, it hangs by a thread throughout the relationship. In fact, that is the challenge of the narcissistic relationship. You will have multiple days when the hope fades more and more and more, and then one day the hope gets rejuvenated because you and the narcissist have a good day, a happy evening, a connected moment. Then hope gets on more firm footing, and the whole cycle begins again. There is that penny drop moment in all narcissistic relationships when the hope does die. It looks different in every relationship. Sometimes it happens when the ultimate betrayal of trust happens. I don't know, an infidelity, or they put a child in harm's way, or get arrested and destroy the family's finances. In those cases, the hope that was already teetering and fragile finally drops. Sometimes it is the behavior of the narcissist when you are sick. You assumed that even though they weren't good, useful in the day-to-day, when the rubber really met the road and life got serious and you got sick, you believed that they would actually finally appreciate you. At that point, you realize they don't, and then hope dies. You believe that as they get older and you help them out and you take care of them, they will finally thank you and apologize for the pain they caused you and so many others throughout your life. Nope. And then the hope dies. It could be the day that their anger and rage continue to escalate and they finally lay hands on you or physically threaten you. Then the hope dies, but sadly, the hope does not die, even when there's physical violence in too many cases. So there is that moment. Sometimes people test the narcissist, wanting to keep hope alive. They will put conjectures to them. What if someday I got sick, or you only had a year to live, or something like that? The answer is usually pretty bleak. And then hope dies. It looks different in every case, but it tends to be the last thing to die in a narcissistic relationship. Lots of people will say they can't unsee what they saw in the relationship. There is a point where to go back feels like giving up on themselves. And in more than a few cases, some people stay even after hope has died. It happens. But maybe they stay with a more realistic assessment of the situation, realistic expectations, and radical acceptance. In a narcissistic relationship, this proverb, that hope dies last, is not a proverb. It almost feels like a truism. And in an ideal world, you will find hope in far better places than this narcissistic relationship, like places like yourself, and the good and respectful and reciprocal spaces in your life. So this is a Zen proverb. Like I said, I've been remiss on doing proverbs, right? So the way it goes is, knowledge is learning something every day. Wisdom is letting go of something every day. Probably something I should listen to where my closets are concerned, but how is this relevant to narcissistic abuse? Because the only way people are going to heal or get past narcissistic abuse is by learning about it. It's amazing how much knowledge really pushes healing. Narcissism and narcissistic abuse are obviously not taught in school. In fact, we're kind of taught the contrary by families, teachers, religious communities, which is find a way to get along. Always forgive. If there's a problem, maybe it's your fault. We are definitely not taught about red flags and behaviors that are unacceptable. For many survivors or experiencers of narcissistic abuse, most will say, before this happened to me, I didn't know this was a thing. I thought a narcissistic person was a person who loves to look in the mirror all the time and brags a lot. I had no idea about the rest of this stuff, the manipulation, the gaslighting, the invalidation. If it happened to you as a child, you just think you had a terrible childhood. And it may even be normalized. So this means that learning about it is a key. But this proverb is saying learning isn't enough. You can get it, but still be continually harmed by it. So this proverb is saying this is where we get into wisdom. Because the letting go is the key, and I tend to agree with that. When you are trying to heal from narcissistic abuse, what are you trying to let go of? You're trying to let go of lots of stuff. You're trying to let go of internalized narratives about how you are not enough and your needs don't matter. You're trying to let go of the hope that the narcissistic relationship can change. You're trying to let go of the hope that you can change them. You're trying to let go of the hope of the idea of a normal family happy marriage, a certain kind of a life. You're letting go of the idea that the only way we'll be loved is by silencing our needs, wants, and aspirations. Letting go of the idea that if you forgive them, then everything will be okay. You're letting go of the idea that other people will support your decision and see it too. You're letting go of the idea that they will someday be punished or there will be some form of karmic payback. Wisdom is about letting go of the many narratives, assumptions, distortions, beliefs, and hopes that keep these relationships going, and for a while, perhaps even kept you going. And that can be really challenging, because then what comes in to fill in that place? In theory, that's where the knowledge can step in, as well as ensuring that you wrote down what happened and allow yourself to remember what the relationship was really like. Not let the trauma-bonded justifications sugarcoat the whole experience and keep pulling you back in. Because ultimately, wisdom is about letting go of the relationship. Maybe not literally. Maybe it's not about you engaging. Maybe it's about lower contact. Maybe it is staying in, but staying in with radical acceptance. Maybe it is ending the relationship. It all depends on your situation. Wisdom isn't just about walking away. Wisdom is about seeing it and releasing the narratives and justifications that keep you stuck, whether literally or mentally. Trauma bonding makes letting go difficult. So if you are struggling with it, it is not a lack of wisdom as much as it is a difficulty in digging into old cycles, giving yourself permission to be fully yourself, giving yourself permission for your needs and wants, and no longer equating chaos and love. It's a lot easier to learn about something than it is to let something go. In an ideal world, we can do both. And it is essential, since the knowledge will prop up those holes where you learn to let things go and where the wisdom came from. So I like this proverb because I think it's a great one for healing and lets us know that it's a process, not just the knowing, but also the willingness to let things go. Listen, if you don't have a lot of money, narcissistic relationships will actually take a far, far greater toll on you. Not having enough money is a stressor. It saps your bandwidth. There's good research showing that. And it can mean that solving any problem becomes far more complicated. Problems are a lot easier to fix when you've got money. When you don't have money, you may not be able to afford good quality therapy. Could be that the free therapy you can access may not be well matched to what you need. You may have an unstable housing situation. You may not have access to reliable transportation. You may be living with food insecurity. You may not be able to get ahead of your debt and do the things that would help with stress management, like a day off. Even in the best of circumstances, not having financial resources is a horrible stressor. If you're dealing with a toxic relationship, it literally feels almost impossible. And you might even feel that all the content out there doesn't even begin to scratch the surface on what you're going through. A lot of the guidance on narcissistic abuse, and I'll be very open and frank, I believe I've made that mistake too, assumes that people have some level of resources, access to therapy, the ability to move somewhere else if you need, the luxury of launching into a job search, having enough time to be able to journal or meditate, being able to afford an attorney, to get health care. If you don't have resources, you may even be stuck living with a very narcissistic family of origin or having some of them live with you. You may not be able to afford a caregiver for an elderly narcissistic parent who needs care, or not being able to balance childcare. So you may get stuck in a job with an abusive boss just because the hours or the locations work. And because of this, when a person who has limited resources, limited money, is in a narcissistic relationship, even if they want to leave, for example, leave a marriage or a long-term relationship, honest to goodness, it's almost simply not possible. I live in Southern California where rent is eye-wateringly expensive. And hell, even middle-class folks who even own their houses are stuck staying married because they can't afford to split the equity in the house, because half of that money, even if they made a lot of money on that house, won't buy anything here anymore. And if that money is just used on rent, it's going to run out pretty quick. People also may not be able to move away, where they may have better supports or more affordable housing. If they have minor children, then they have to stay often where they are, near the other co-parent, even if that person's toxic. So then radical acceptance isn't exactly the same as it would be for someone who has resources. Radical acceptance, sadly, then kind of becomes an acceptance of stuck, like really stuck. And that's going to have a very different kind of mental health toll. So many people are stuck in these toxic relationships because they simply do not have the means to get out. They can't afford an attorney, or childcare, or rent, or therapy. And so they stay in something that is continuing to take a pretty marked toll on them, on top of the stress that not having enough money is already causing. You already feel so helpless in one of these relationships. Nothing you say works, makes it better. Nothing you do works. You have to give up so much of yourself just to get through most days. And hope is a dangerous thing, since it is likely to go south really fast. The not having resources is a multiplier on that helplessness and hopelessness. And there's also the added frustration that most of the content out there on narcissism and narcissistic relationship, videos, books, whatever, most of it is based on having some access to resources, enough to get some basic help. But listen, if you don't have money, you may not even have a great internet connection or a reliable cell service or the stuff that would even allow you to listen to a video like this or get a book or get the information that you need on a regular basis. When I started thinking about this video, I didn't have any easy answers. I don't think I do still. The best I was hoping to offer up was an empathy and a recognition, frankly, that there's a double helplessness that people who do not have financial resources face. And as a result, people in these circumstances may also feel more shamed or self-blaming. Look at me, I'm staying in something that's so unhealthy. It becomes important to understand the logistics of why you're staying. It's a reason a lot of people stay. You may end up moving back in with a narcissistic family of origin, and that can feel horrible. It can be just absolutely horrible. But you can also see it wholly, fully, and armed with what you know about how these dynamics and systems work. Learn to talk to yourself internally in a different way. None of this is easy. Being exposed to that, even when you know what it is, takes a toll on you. Realistic expectations are available to anyone, regardless of how many resources they have. And in the case of folks who are strapped and living close to the bone, to understand that your decisions, while they may not be optimal, are informed by those realistic expectations as well. That you may be having to make decisions that will protect children or other family members or yourself. As I talk with more people around the world about this, financial limitation is jumping out at me as a major issue that people facing narcissistic families and relationships and workplaces are grappling with. And while you do not and will not have the luxury of making the big changes in a safe way that someone with money could, there are still the micro changes that are a possibility. Practicing not going deep, not defending, not engaging, not explaining, not personalizing. Engaging in little steps to break out of the self-blame. Finding small ways of stretching into your true self, even if it's laughing loud at something when you are alone, or having something you love reading and keeping it to yourself so it isn't ridiculed. And definitely no longer looking to the narcissist for validation or recognition, sharing information with them that they're just going to invalidate, and learning to disengage in a very intentional way. I know that all of this is still putting a Band-Aid on a gushing wound, but those tiny changes and recognition that these relationships are never any of our fault is crucial. But I do think that people who are trying to cope with narcissistic abuse with very limited resources are facing a very, very unique kind of steep slope. And so much of the conversation often becomes about that what we call psychosocial stuff, housing and transport and childcare and jobs and money. And all of that's obviously survival level stuff. But lost in this conversation can often be the additional toll a toxic relationship is putting on someone and the absolute inescapability of that circumstance. The inescapability, the powerlessness, the inability to turn it off, the lack of capacity for safe escape can often mean that what accumulates in these relationships can slowly but surely accumulate into what feels like complex trauma. I hope that's helpful, and thank you again.